In the quiet, ravaging town of Maitama, nestled between rolling hills and vast grain fields, lived the Thompson family. The Thompsons were a prominent family known for their success in business and their active involvement in the community. Mr. Robert Thompson had built a prosperous real estate empire from the ground up, while Mrs. Caroline Thompson was a philanthropist, dedicating her time to various charitable causes. Together, they had one child, a son named Andrew, who was the center of their world. Andrew was born into privilege. From the moment he took his first breath, his parents vowed to give him everything they had never had growing up. Robert had been raised in a strict household where his every move was monitored, and Caroline had grown up in a large, struggling family where luxuries were few and far between. They both agreed that Andrew would not have to endure the hardships they had faced. Instead, they would shower him with love, affection, and every material possession he could ever want. As a young boy, Andrew was cheerful and curious, always exploring and asking questions. His parents doted on him endlessly, fulfilling his every wish. If he wanted a toy, they bought it for him. If he didn't want to eat his vegetables, they let him have dessert instead. If he got into trouble at school, they would smooth things over with a donation or a kind word to the teacher, brushing aside any consequences. He's just a child, they would say. He will learn as he grows. But as Andrew grew, the consequences of their leniency began to manifest. By the time he reached secondary school, Andrew and his friends had become accustomed to getting their way. Andrew would argue with teachers, skip homework, and disregard rules, knowing that his parents would back him up no matter what. His grades became very poor, but Robert and Caroline were more concerned with his happiness than his academic performance. They hired tutors, but Andrew refused to listen. They enrolled him in extracurricular activities, but he quickly lost interest. His parents continued to excuse his behavior, believing that he was simply going through a phase. By the time Andrew entered SS3, his behavior had escalated. He began hanging out with a group of boys known for their reckless behavior. They were wealthy, like Andrew, and used their parents' influence to get away with nearly anything. Andrew found himself drawn to the thrill of it all, and his parents, oblivious to the dangers, continued to turn a blind eye. Andrew was always available to hang out with his friends, but he was never available to go to school. Andrew would lie to his parents that he is going to school. He will wake up in the morning, dress up in his school uniform, and leave the house, only to go hang out with his group of friends every single day. He and his friends would always sneak out from classes to go play basketball, have fun, and just play random things outside the school premises. This was Andrew's way of life every single day throughout his senior secondary school education. His grades were seriously slipping, and he was behaving very poorly in his academics. Andrew never for once stopped to think about what he was doing, or stopped to think about how this was affecting his education. He just kept having fun with his friends every single day. They would walk around the whole of Maitama looking for one fun activity or the other to engage in. One weekend, Andrew and his friends decided to have a party at the Thompson estate while his parents were busy on a business trip. The boys invited dozens of classmates, and soon the house was filled with teenagers, loud music, and alcohol. Andrew, wanting to impress his friends, boasted about his parents' wealth and showed off their expensive belongings. The party raged on into the night, growing more out of control with every passing hour. As the night wore on, Andrew and his closest friends decided to take his father's brand new sports car for a spin. They had all been drinking, but that didn't stop them. They wanted to have the time of their lives, and they didn't care that they were drunk or that they were under the influence of alcohol. And so, Andrew alerted some of his friends, and immediately they stepped out of the house to go ride in his dad's brand new sports car. The thrill of the speed, the roaring engine, and the rush of adrenaline made Andrew feel invisible. He kept on drinking as he sped down the winding country roads, the wind whipping through his hair. Andrew forgot about the risk of drinking and driving. And as they approached a sharp curve, Andrew lost control of the car. The vehicle skidded off the road, slamming into a tree with a sickening crash. The sound of metal crunching and glass shattering filled the air, and then there was silence. In the aftermath, the scene was chaotic. Emergency services arrived quickly, the flashing lights of ambulances and police cars illuminating the dark road. Andrew and his friends were pulled from the wreckage, battered and bloody. One of the boys was unconscious, barely clinging to life. Andrew, though seriously injured, was conscious enough to understand the gravity of what had just happened. When Robert and Caroline received the call, they were thousands of miles away, attending a business conference in New York. The phone rang in the middle of the night, jolting them awake in their hotel room. Caroline answered, her heart pounding as she listened to the panicked voice on the other end. The words blurred together: accident, hospital, critical condition. Robert could only watch as Caroline's face turned pale, her eyes wide with shock. They immediately booked the first flight back home, a flight that felt like an eternity. Neither spoke much during the journey, each lost in their thoughts, grappling with a mix of fear, guilt, and disbelief. How could this have happened? How had their sweet little boy ended up in such a situation? When they arrived at the hospital, the sterile smell and the harsh fluorescent lights made the reality even more unbearable. Andrew was in the intensive care unit, hooked up to machines that beeped and hummed, monitoring his vital signs. His face was bruised, his arm in a cast, and he had suffered several broken ribs. The doctors were cautiously optimistic about his recovery, but the injuries were serious. As they stood by Andrew's bedside, Robert and Caroline were told about the condition of the other boys. One was in critical condition, and the prognosis was uncertain. The others had sustained serious injuries but were expected to recover. The weight of what had happened hit them hard. This wasn't just about Andrew. Other lives were at stake too. The Thompsons had to face the police, who were investigating the accident. The authorities made it clear that charges could be brought against Andrew for driving under the influence and reckless endangerment. The Thompsons, who had always managed to shield their son from consequences, realized that this time there was no escaping reality. In the days that followed, Robert and Caroline started to feel guilty. They sat by Andrew's side, watching him sleep, replaying every decision they had made as parents. They had wanted to give Andrew the world, to protect him from the harshness of life, but in doing so, they had failed to prepare him for it. They had never taught him about responsibility, about the consequences of his actions, or about the importance of discipline, and now they were paying the price. When Andrew finally woke up and got discharged from the hospital, the first thing he saw was his parents' sad faces. He didn't fully understand what had happened at first, but as the memories came flooding back, he felt a wave of dread wash over him. He remembered the crash, the screams, and the sickening realization that he had hurt his friends. As Andrew slowly recovered, his parents made the difficult decision to be honest with him about everything. They told him about the legal consequences he might face, about the injuries his friends had incurred because of the car accident. However, the emotional scars ran much deeper. One of his friends was in a coma, with doctors uncertain if he would ever wake up. The parents of the injured boys arrived soon after, their faces etched with grief and anger. Robert and Caroline could hardly meet their eyes, knowing they had allowed this tragedy to happen. Robert and Caroline were devastated, but they knew they couldn't change the past. All they could do now was learn from their mistakes and help Andrew rebuild his life. They stayed by his side, comforting him as best they could. When Andrew finally opened up to them, it was with tears in his eyes. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I never thought it would come to this." Robert and Caroline exchanged a look, both knowing this was a turning point, not just for Andrew, but for their family. "We are sorry too," Caroline said, her voice trembling. "We should have been stricter with you, Andrew. We thought we were doing the right thing by giving you everything, but we failed to give you what you needed most: guidance and boundaries." Andrew nodded, unable to speak. He knew his parents loved him, but he also knew that love alone wasn't enough. He needed structure, discipline, and the understanding that his actions had real-world consequences. When Andrew's friend finally woke up from coma, and the rest of his friends got discharged from the hospital, the Thompsons made a pact as a family to change. They started by setting clear rules and expectations. Andrew was grounded for the foreseeable future. His driving privileges were revoked indefinitely, and he was required to attend therapy sessions to work through the trauma of the accident. Robert and Caroline also began attending parenting classes to learn how to set appropriate boundaries and enforce them effectively. As time passed, Andrew began to rebuild his life. He graduated from secondary school with a very good result and was accepted into a very good university. He chose to study psychology, driven by a desire to understand human behavior and help others avoid the mistakes he had made. His parents too grew from the experience. They became advocates for balanced parenting, often speaking at community events and sharing their story in the hopes of preventing similar tragedies. Years later, Andrew looked back on that dark period of his life with a mixture of regret and gratitude. He regretted the pain he had caused and the near loss of his friend, but he was also grateful for the lessons he had learned. He understood now that his parents' leniency, while well-intentioned, had left him unprepared for the real world. It was their strictness, their newfound willingness to say no, that had ultimately saved him. In the end, the Thompsons learned a valuable lesson. Love alone is not enough. Children need boundaries, guidance, and discipline to navigate the complexities of life. Without them, they can easily lose their way, mistaking freedom for recklessness and indulgence for happiness. The strictness they had once avoided became the foundation upon which they rebuilt their family, stronger and more united than ever before. And Andrew, now a young man with a promising future, was living proof that sometimes the hardest lessons are the most important ones. The end.